There are 3 conditions that must be satisfied before testing a hypothesis regarding population proportions. You can also see this on your overview sheet. Here are the 2. It needs to be independent and normally distributed. The last one is the independence. This is the normally distributed. And the first criteria is that it must be obtained randomly. Here you can notice that the formula is slightly different. This is going to be p sub 0, and that's what you're testing. So if you're able to find this p sub 0, it's the same number. And then there are 5 steps to test a hypothesis about a population proportion. Here are your 3 options. You can have a two-tailed, left-tailed, or right-tailed. Notice two-tailed is not equal, left-tailed is less, and right-tailed is greater than. Also notice that the null hypothesis always has the equal sign, and that these numbers will always match up. In the first letter here, the P, represents that we're working with a proportion. Step 2 is select a level of confidence alpha, depending on the seriousness of making a type 1 error. This in this course will be given to you for every question. If you are doing this outside of this class, you will have to determine what you want your alpha to be, depending on the seriousness, again, of making a type 1 error. Type 1 errors and type 2 errors were discussed in lesson 10.1. Step 3 is use number 12 on the calculator sheet to obtain the p-value. Step 4, if the p-value is less than alpha, reject the null hypothesis. And we can add in here, if p-value is greater than alpha, we can say we do not reject the null hypothesis. And then you can state your conclusion. So let's look at an example. The 2 major college entrance exams that a majority of colleges accept for a student admission are the SAT and ACT. ACT looked at historical records and established 22 as the minimum ACT math score for a student to be considered prepared for college mathematics. An official with the Illinois State Department of Education wonders whether less than half of the students in her state are prepared for college algebra. She obtains a simple random sample of 500 records of students who have taken the ACT and finds that 219 are prepared for college mathematics. That is, scored at least 22 on the ACT math test. Does this represent significant evidence that less than half of Illinois students are prepared for college mathematics upon graduation from a high school? So the first thing is verify the conditions. Is it random? Yes, it is. It is simple random sample. So that's good. Then we have our n times p sub 0, 1 minus p sub 0. We need to make sure it's greater than or equal to 10. N is 500, that's our sample. P sub 0, so what are we trying to test our hypothesis against? Our null hypothesis is going to be our proportion equal to something, and our alternative is p either not equal, less than, or greater than. So if you go back up to the question, it says less than half. Less than, and how do you write half as a proportion? 0.5. So this is p sub 0, so p sub 0 here is also 0.5. You do that math, you get 125, and that is greater than or equal to 10. And then is it independent? So 500, is that less than 5% of Illinois students? It is. If you aren't sure, you can divide by 0.05 to get 10,000. Is there at least 10,000 students in Illinois? There is. So it is independent. Step 1, we already completed. Notice that the null hypothesis says equal and that the proportions match up. These are proportions, so this should be P. Note it, or just take note that in the next lesson we're going to be talking about means. So instead of P here, we're going to have mu here. Step 2 is determine your level of significance. That's stated right here for you. Step 3 is to calculate. So we're going to use number 12 on our calculator sheet. You can fill that in on our overview sheet. We're under sample proportion and working with hypothesis test. Okay, so we're going to go to stat test number 5. P sub 0, we said that was 0.5. Our X, we had 219 out of the 500. And we were working with less than. So our test statistic, you can see from our calculator, it is Z is our test statistic, and you can note that our test statistic for population is Z, and then for mean, sample mean, it's T. So Z sub 0, that's what it'll look like on your homework, is equal to negative 2.77, and your p-value is equal to 0.0028. Step 4 is to compare your p-value to your alpha. So that is less than 0.05. So we reject the null hypothesis. Step 5 is to state the conclusion. There is sufficient evidence at the alpha equaling 0.05 level of significance to conclude that fewer than half of the Illinois students are prepared for college mathematics. Here's a paragraph just explaining that a little bit more. The p-value of 0.003 means that if the null hypothesis that p equals 0.5 is true, we expect 219 or fewer successes in 500 trials and less than one sample in 100. Because the results are unusual, the p-value is less than the level of significance alpha, we reject the null hypothesis. There is sufficient evidence at the alpha equaling 0.05 level of significance to conclude that less than half of the Illinois students are prepared for college mathematics. In other words, the data suggests that less than a majority of the students in Illinois are prepared for college mathematics. All right, now we have another example, so I'd like you to go ahead and try this. Pause the video and then resume. When asked the following question, which do you think is more important, protecting the right of Americans to own guns or controlling gun ownership? 46% of Americans said that protecting the right to own guns is more important. The Pew Research Center surveyed 1,267 randomly selected Americans with at least a bachelor's degree and found that 559 believe that protecting the right to own guns is more important. Does this result suggest that the proportion of Americans with at least a bachelor's degree feel differently than the general American population when it comes to gun control? Use the alpha equaling 0.1 level of significance. So first we need to verify the conditions. Is it randomly selected? Yes, it is. So random is good. What about our n times p times 1 minus p? Is that greater than or equal to 10? Our n is 1,267. P. What is our p? So the question asks, does this result suggest that the proportion of Americans with at least a bachelor's degree is different than the general American population? So we're comparing it to the general American. So 0.46. It is equal to 314.7, which is greater than or equal to 10. And then independence. So we have 25,340. And there is definitely more than 25,340 Americans. So that is good. Step 1, determine the null and alternative hypothesis. Okay, we're working with proportions, so put p there. We know our null has to have the equal. I'm working with 0.46. Keywords here is feel differently. If you go back to 10.1, keywords differently is going to be your two-tailed word, keyword. So we're going to put not equal. Step 2 is your alpha. Up above it says your alpha is going to be 0.1. And then we need to calculate this. So we'll go stats, tests, number 5, 0.46. $559 out of 1,267, not equal, and then calculate. So our z is negative 1.34. P-value was 0.1794. Step 4, compare your P to your alpha. That is greater than that, so we do not reject the null hypothesis. It may be helpful for you to circle the one that you're going with. I'm not saying you're accepting it, I'm just saying that might be helpful to circle. So that way, when you interpret it in step 5, it might be a little easier for you. So when we do not reject the null hypothesis, we can say there is not sufficient evidence at the alpha equaling 0.1 level of significance to conclude that Americans with at least a bachelor's degree feel differently than the general American population when it comes to gun control. Again, this is a summary. The p-value of 0.1794 means that if the null hypothesis that p equals 0.46 is true, we expect the type of results we observed, or more extreme results, in about 18 out of 100 samples. Because the results are not unusual, the p-value is greater than the level of significance, we do not reject the null hypothesis. There is not sufficient evidence at the alpha equaling 0.1 level of significance to conclude that Americans with at least a bachelor's degree feel differently than the general American population when it comes to gun control.